I now hand you over to Professor Alderman for his presentation, Making a Place Named Freedom, Black Livingness, Onomastic Activism, and Civil Rights Struggles in the USA. Professor Alderman, thank you.
Just want to check and see if everybody can see that. All right, so well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. I'm honored to be here. I'm going to be talking today about my interest in naming, specifically place naming, as related to the African American freedom struggle in the United States. And this is really part of trying to understand in a more broader way the role of naming within social justice and civil rights. In terms of place name study, this map here is where it all started for me. My work started in the 1990s as I was studying the naming of streets for civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. I was interested in where these streets are located. I was interested in who was renaming them, which was largely African American local communities. I was interested in the implications of that renaming for American popular cultural memory. I think it's worth mentioning, and we see a map here of over 1,000 of these Martin Luther King streets, that the renaming of streets after King, which really started as early as 1968 with his assassination, signaled a major racial shift in U.S. road naming, which had been devoted almost entirely to remembering white males and to a much, much lesser extent, white females. So this was a watershed change in the American landscape, in American place naming, and in American memory. But what's also interesting, and what I realized early on in the 1990s and have been talking about since then, is that map that you just saw of those streets named for Dr. King doesn't really fully capture the social impact, the implications. It doesn't capture the social politics of naming roads for MLK. Martin Luther King streets have often been embattled arenas, a word that I began coining back in the 90s, that there are these public spaces where African Americans often face stiff opposition to the naming process as they seek to honor their hero, and really a hero for all Americans. It's often led in some cases to boycotts and marches and petitions and arrests, vandalism, very, very long extended public debates and city council meetings and state government meetings. And what I've become very interested in as a result of studying Martin Luther King streets, which is related to the topic for today, is I've become very interested in what I call Black onomastic activism, Black naming activism, in which African Americans that I have worked with and had the pleasure to learn from, they tell me how important place names are to them, not just as symbols, but as ways of claiming and trying to exert some control over public space, to make room for public space for their histories and their identities, and to challenge the legacies of segregation. Because one of the things that's quite interesting about these Martin Luther King streets is that there's often this very intense struggle over which part of town will actually bear King's name. Will King's name be confined to the Black area of a city for Black neighborhoods, or will it be allowed to extend beyond and past certain racial and economic boundaries? And that has tended to be the real crux of the debate about these issues. And so it reflects in many ways how these streets, they remember a civil rights leader, but at the same time, they remain a civil rights issue for many contemporary African American communities. So my work with naming streets for Dr. King led me to make some really interesting contributions to critical place name studies, which is what I call what I do. I work with really fantastic colleagues like Ruben Rose Redwood, Miles Yahoo, Jordan Brasher, Joshua Inwood, and we've been working on this idea of, what does a more critical place name study look like? And we don't have the time or the space here to try to sum it up, but it basically suggests that place names are more than just a catalog artifact. That in fact, the naming of place is an integral part of the social construction and the contesting of place. That in fact, place names are part of the technology of governance and power and resistance. They are part of the apparatus of capitalism. They are part of the apparatus of colonialism and settler colonialism. They can be often very much controlled by government and business elites and whole regimes. We're seeing right now in the United States where the Trump administration is taking an active control and use of place names as part of its ideological agenda. But one of the things that's fascinated me and guided a lot of my work over the years has been the fact that I'm interested in ordinary people. I'm interested in how ordinary people interpret and react to and rewrite place names. And I'm interested in particular, excuse me, I'm interested in particular in how marginalized groups, and in this case, in my case, looking at Black communities, how they see place naming as a counter-hegemonic practice. Not that they would use those words, but how they see this as a tool of resistance and a tool for self-determination. In other words, how do they see place names as part of their efforts to redraw a map of America in which their lived experiences, their histories, and their belonging matter and actually appear on that kind of map? And even though I've certainly been well informed and inspired by a lot of academic social theories, as a lot of critical place name studies have been, I really have to tell you that I've learned an equal amount from working with local communities who are pushing for a naming reform. And in fact, I'd like to dedicate this talk today to a real leader and activist and mentor of mine, Terrence Dix, who regrettably died just a couple of years ago. And I learned a great deal about what the meaning of place names are from the perspective of ordinary activists from Terrence. Terrence taught me those things. And Terrence was very much about, well, we need to connect Martin Luther King streets to economic development. We need to connect Martin Luther King streets to health justice, to addressing the needs of communities, not just for the sake of symbolism, but for the sake that that name can be connected to some of these larger material, socially structural issues. And so I'm indebted to the communities that have been patient enough and kind enough to allow me to learn from them. And since beginning the study of Martin Luther King streets, my focus has shifted, it's broadened, it's expanded. And I'm interested in place naming much more generally. And in particular, I've gotten very interested with the growing public debates about place names that have been going on. In fact, it's something that I would call, America's ongoing place naming moment, where we're seeing a huge number of public debates over the meaning and the history and the reform of place names, the removal of names of racist historical figures, the replacement of some of those names with different people, different histories, different value systems. And I would say, for those who are not aware of it, I'm pretty sure you guys are aware of it, that in the United States, place names and the social narratives that they carry and embody have become major flashpoints in struggles over racial and ethnic and gender identities and inequalities. And I've tried to put up a few headlines here to capture how much place naming has become such a contested terrain in the United States. And in fact, I think a lot of what I'm interested in now applies to an even broader landscape of issues. And so, and you know, and maybe I'm talking a little bit too much about myself. I mean, don't all academics do that to a certain extent? I know you are not, I can't see you in the audience, but I'm sure you're laughing at my humor. But in addition to publishing traditional academic pieces, I've sought to try to translate and apply some of the ideas from critical place name studies to place name policy and education. And it's led me, for example, to work for the U.S. federal government for about 2 years before my committee was terminated by the Trump administration. And it's allowed me to write public-facing pieces and to engage in public-facing speaking as I tried to really take a lot of these very interesting theoretical political ideas and learn from the public and inform the public and really learn with the public. And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons I want to bring this up is that I have a vision of name study that in which, you know, scholars have a responsibility to put their scholarship to work. I use that phrase a lot, putting your ideas to work. It's the idea of making your ideas understandable, useful, and responsive to a society as it's facing really major divisive naming debates. So one of the central ideas behind my talk today is really this statement here, that even though we see these, you know, before the Black Lives Matter movements, during the Black Lives Matter movements, and now after those movements, we see an especially large amount of intense renaming debates and place name struggles. But I would suggest to you that really some of the ongoing place renaming struggles that we see may appear new, they may appear relatively recent, but they're actually part of a wider history of Black activism and placemaking that I want to talk with you today about. And I want us to sort of think about what role does naming, specifically place naming, perhaps play in social movements beyond what we sort of have traditionally recognized in the literature. So my goal today is I'd like to explore with you understanding the role of place names and the long history and geography of U.S. Race relations, and talking about both white supremacy, but also talking about anti-racist Black resistance. Although really my focus is on Black activist communities. I'd like to explore this notion of an onomastic activism that took place in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And we're talking a little bit about one of those civil rights organizations called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. But what I mean by this onomastic activism is that I want to reaffirm the idea that Black communities have long, not just recently, but have long used place naming and renaming as tools of resistance, of remembrance, and as a way of reconstructing society, as part of their freedom work. And it's important to point out that, you know, particularly in the U.S. context where people use the word freedom a great deal, but there's often not enough critical thought amongst really white communities about what freedom really is. Freedom is not simply given. As many African Americans will tell you, freedom is something that you work for. It's the result of the physical, social, and emotional labor of self-determination. And in the word of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, you know, freedom is a place, and you have to make that place. And that's sort of the context to my title of my talk today. And you know, very quickly, what I'm suggesting to you is that historically and now in the contemporary, place naming and place naming struggles are a form of Black livingness, using the really fantastic work of Catherine McKittrick, who is a pioneer in Black geographies. In other words, place naming is part of the process of Black humanity. It's part of creating present and future Black worlds, and it's about narrating stories and identity in the face of oppression, and also stories of joy and joys and stories of creativity. And so what I would encourage you to do is we really put place naming in a larger historical geographic context and within the story of Black struggle, that we need a framework. And I think Catherine McKittrick has given us a very fine framework. And so, for example, some of the photos that you see here are photographs of places where African Americans, long before the 20th century, had established their own settlements and named those settlements in certain distinctive ways to draw attention to their aspirations for freedom, their commemoration of historical figures or places that are identified with self-determination. And it gets us thinking about, in fact, how these names connect to the larger story of Black America and are actively used by Black America as tools for identity. But first, let's talk a little bit about some of the different social roles and power and impacts of place names. And I apologize in advance if this is sort of review for a lot of people. I wasn't sure exactly how much people knew about place naming. I'm very grateful for my colleagues' talk that we just had. What a fantastic lecture that was, which really laid out some of the basic theoretical foundations. But I want us to sort of look at what is place naming from the context of understanding the complex and really often under-acknowledged role of place naming within the social life of Black Americans. And I think that probably is as much as this is an introduction to place naming, it's also an introduction to what naming means to many of those activist communities. Well, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but, you know, place names are deceivingly simple. They seem to be very straightforward. They're very short. We see them, we think we understand them, but they actually have many different careers and social roles within our life. Everything from assisting us with navigation and giving legibility and standardization to the landscape, to this idea of place branding, which we heard about just a few minutes ago, the commodification of place. Place names are used to sell and market and to own place. And then, of course, what is really important to me in my work is looking at the way that place names are these major community symbols that come to frame a common sense of history or a common origin story about a country or a state or a city or even a neighborhood. And so looking at, in fact, place names as commemorative symbols is especially interesting to me. So what I'd like to do for the next couple of slides, next few slides is to review three major lenses that I think can be very helpful to understanding the social power and the social impact of place naming, especially from the perspective of those marginalized communities who are often engaged historically and now in a lot of place name debate and struggle. So one of the first of those lenses is a narrative lens. In other words, recognizing that place names have a tremendous narrative capacity, that place names are their text embedded in these larger systems of representation and discourse and storytelling. I emphasize a lot about storytelling. And that the public often makes judgments about places and people and histories on the basis of those texts. And that, in fact, place names have the power to, in their own unique way, to weave stories and identities into everyday settings and practices. And in fact, it's the idea that place names emplace those stories in everyday public spaces and interactions that really makes them especially powerful. Activists have certainly understood and recognized that. And in fact, activists have recognized, the many that I've worked with and the many that I read about, have recognized that, you know, place naming can be an effective form of counter storytelling, telling stories that challenge the dominant narratives about who people are and who's valuable and who matters in society. And there is a very unique narrative structure to place names. They're, again, very, very short, 1 or 2 words. Miles Azrayahu, one of my mentors and heroes in place name study, says they're like the title of a book. You know, so they tell you what to expect, but they don't tell you the whole story. They're a symbolic shorthand. And really, place names seek to narrate and frame reality in ways that have limits, but at the same time, they also have a tremendous visibility and connectivity and power to them. And so very quickly, you know, keep in mind that place names often have with them, once you investigate place names, you can discover these wider stories and these wider biographies of people, in the case of commemorative place names, that exist beyond the name or behind the name. And in fact, you know, some communities like there in New Orleans, they've been actively doing audits of place names to find out, well, you know, who our street names, who are they named after? Who were these people? Were these people who reflect the value system that we want to uphold at this moment? And keeping in mind that place names often work through their connectivity. They often work through an intertextual power where they can connect with other narratives and frame their meaning in the context of other narratives, which I think is particularly powerful. And in fact, you know, African-American activists have recognized that in Columbus, Georgia, where they have a street named for, they have actually an outdoor learning trail that's named after Martin Luther King. And along that trail, you don't just learn about Dr. King, but you learn about these other civil rights leaders. So you're connecting stories and narratives together in a way that that place names are able to facilitate. The second lens that we can use to understand place naming is through a material capacity. In other words, the idea being that, you know, place names do not exist on the head of a pen. They do not exist in a vacuum. Material spaces and relations are created around and through the naming of places. And in fact, place names can shape people's movements and their practices and their infrastructures. Names give meaning to the daily landscape as we interact with that landscape and as we draw identity from it and as we use it as a resource, as we gain accessibility to it. Activists recognize this very much. And it's not that the activists have been reading the theory that we have put out, but they intuitively, in a public organic intellectual way, recognize that place names are embedded in these wider social and spatial inequalities and relations. And so I've developed this phrase or term called namescape to really capture the idea that place names have a relationship with their larger spaces that they're found in. And that term is meant to capture the meaning of place names in terms of their larger social and material context. And so, for example, if I take you to Hilton Head, South Carolina, in the southeastern part of the United States, and Hilton Head, South Carolina is a resort economy, a very exclusive place, a place where retirees come to finish their lives, a place where tourists come and visit and go to the beach and take in what is a very romanticized Southern culture. And so many of the places on Hilton Head Island were historically plantations, but really the word plantation, the place name plantation, is used in Hilton Head in a much more commodified way, a much more marketing way to try to signal this symbolic capital, this exclusiveness that comes from staying in a condo or an apartment or a subdivision named plantation. And you can imagine that using plantation in such an uncritical and commercialized way has led many people to be upset. And it's led for calls. It's led African Americans and white allies to call for the removal of those names or references to plantation, which in some cases it's happened and in some cases it's not happened. But it really sort of suggests to you that in the case of Hilton Head, it's not just a difficult derogatory symbol or name. It's also the fact that that name on Hilton Head is connected. It's part of a larger namescape. It's connected to a larger geography of displacement because there are vibrant African American communities living on that island that have been squeezed out because of tourist economy, because of land development and land grabs. And so you can't understand that place name in Hilton Head without understanding the patterns of material disposition that can happen through place names. And then the third and final lens that I'd like to bring your attention to is this idea of affective capacities, and thinking about the idea that place names matter socially. They have a social impact, they have a social power, because they can become entangled in people's emotions, their experiences, their lives. They can take on feet, they can be the center of people's feelings, as my colleague in the last talk captured so well. They can be the site of social action or inaction. And naming works through people's personal and place experiences to create these broader racialized and gendered atmospheres that then work on people. So we work to create those names, but then those names come back and work on us. And activists have recognized, in fact, I mean, they're the ones who have really taught me in very clear terms that they connect a lot of place naming debates and struggles to their concerns about the political, emotional well-being of marginalized communities. And so naming can, in fact, mark and reproduce violence. There's many kinds of violence. It's not just physical violence as we sort of in the United States typically think of, but there's symbolic, social violence, administrative violence, but names can mark and in fact reproduce the violence. They can wound places. They can create wounded places for people who live in those particular communities that are hurt and traumatized by those names. And at the same time, if naming is part of the through its effective capacity of naming as part of the violence and the wounding of people in place, perhaps if it's done in a reparative way, it could be part of the healing or the repair of those wounds. And again, I need to keep moving along here. I'm enjoying talking to you too much, and so I got to stay on track. But I will tell you that, here's a number of different examples of the relationship that can develop between place naming and these affective bodily performances that happen in cities and in communities where, if we think about like my buddy Ruben Rose Redwood said so well, counter place naming, which is often what's carried out by activist progressive communities, it can happen through embodied protest and embodied movements and speech acts that don't always ask for permission from the state to exist. So in other words, even if a place is not renamed, a derogatory, offensive place is not renamed, people in fact can still affect change by their performances and by their affective practices. And so this leads us to, this is the question that keeps me up at night. And it's especially interesting question related to issues of the social impact of place naming and the social impact of naming in general. Is what are the reparative possibilities, but also the limits of place naming to address systemic racism? And what I mean by reparative is how far can place naming get us to making amends for those wounds? How far can it take us to coming to terms with social injustices? How far can place naming go to actually lead to a wider reconciliation? And I would suggest to you that what I have sort of learned the last several years is that name change in and of itself is not reparative. It requires very clear strategies to put naming into what I call relational action. In other words, how do you connect that place name with wider social and geographic change? And it's not simply about changing the name of itself, but it's how does those changes get incorporated into the many facets and text and performances of life. And this has led me to, which is probably not a great little graphic, you can blame PowerPoint on that, but this has led me and a few of my colleagues to talk a lot about this notion of place naming as an assemblage, and thinking about all the complex and emerging entities and relations that shape place naming, and thinking about how a reparative approach really requires a reworking of the relationships between place naming, which is there in the middle of this graphic, and all of the different social actors and social practices and social narratives and spaces and policies and feelings that exist. And so if you want to have a reparative approach, you can't simply focus on the middle of that graphic. You have to look at all of the ways in which the renaming itself works with and against some of these issues that we have. All right. And I would also add that, you know, as I say, that the name and the name change in and of itself can only do so much in bringing about social reform. What we've realized, especially through my work with Ruben Rose Redwood and Jordan Brasher, is that we've realized that we also have to not just repair names, we have to repair the process of naming. We have to expand the participation of people in place naming decisions. We have to pay attention to not just what places are named and who they're named for, but how places get renamed, by whom, who's included or excluded in the name change decision. And how do we incorporate, for example, procedural justice into name decisions, even when you have a name change that seems to be progressive and for the better, and it seems to be more inclusive of marginalized groups. Even if you've done that name change and you haven't had a full participation of communities, especially the communities that have been historically harmed by names, then you're not really being completely reparative in that way. And so, for example, Ruben Rose Redwood has had the pleasure of working with him on a project where, you know, excuse me, we surveyed many universities in US and Canada looking at their name policies, renaming policies for renaming campus spaces and buildings. And only 19% of those universities that were surveyed had publicly accessible name policies. And so for many of those campuses, the public has no idea of how a name change actually can happen, if it indeed can happen. By the way, many of you know that in the United States, and maybe this applies elsewhere, many names of campus buildings and facilities are actually given over to donors. And so, you know, a lot of this is a transactional issue. But what we also found was that there's an even smaller percentage, a very minute percentage of those who had publicly accessible name policies who actually had a provision for public consultation. So even though place names are public spaces for the most part, they're public resources, they're public memories, we don't really heavily, at least in the United States, don't heavily involve the public as much as we should in those name decisions. Well, I have taken a long way to get here, but I'd like to end or conclude by providing a glimpse into some of the Black naming activism of the 1960 SNCC organization. And I'm going to try to go through a few of these questions that I have listed here. But for those who are not aware of it, SNCC was a grassroots youth-led civil rights organization that focused on voting rights, focused on poverty, focused on community empowerment. And again, as I said, they were grassroots from the bottom up. They did not rely on a network of national leaders. They went into communities to do this kind of work and to engage in re-education and assistance in organizing. And so I've been very interested, along with Josh Inwood. Katrina Stack is another colleague that's been working with me on this, and looking at what role did naming play in SNCC's civil rights work. And again, this is work that dates all the way back to the early, mid, and late 1960s. And how did SNCC deploy naming as a resistant tactic? And what, why was it important for SNCC to, how was naming important to SNCC's political imagination? And then what I'm going to suggest to you is that this little glimpse of this chapter of the civil rights movement can be pretty important for us to realize what it takes to be reparative. And what you'll see very quickly in talking about SNCC's use of naming, and particularly place naming, is that they were creating these relational connections between the name change and the name use and what they considered revolutionary place remaking. And so I hope to sort of, use this bit of civil rights history to maybe help inform how we as place name scholars and name scholars see the social impact and the implications of names. Again, I've already sort of explained quite a bit about SNCC. SNCC is identified with several important community activists and organizers, but Ella Baker is probably one of the most important, who helped start SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she emphasized grassroots organizing. That was the sort of vision of the organization. And then one of its most important executive secretaries was James Jim Foreman, who really was into information, communication, research, and also, I think, in many ways set the stage for us to understand how naming could be part of SNCC's politics, because he emphasized geographic knowledge. He emphasized, he was not speaking like a geographer like I am. He was not speaking as a place name scholar like I am and you are or others, but he was thinking about, exactly how do you not just carry out protests, but how do you actually recreate the world through and create freedom as a place, and what's involved to make that happen, culturally, socially, politically, economically, a fundamental transformative structural change. And that's where naming comes into play. One of the things that's fascinating about SNCC is that they carried out a wholesale practice of naming and renaming places and institutions as freedom. So they actually used the word freedom to identify a multitude of different practices and different locations and institutions as well. Schools, libraries, political parties, landmarks. And I've got a few listed here or shown on the slide. Freedom Alley in Albany, Georgia, which was a back alley that was used to line up civil rights activists as they were being taken to jail. We have the Freedom Singers, which was a musical group. This is what, they were called the Freedom Singers. They went into all across the United States raising money for the civil rights movement, and actually then also disseminating the word of what civil rights meant in the Deep South, where SNCC was doing a lot of its work. Freedom Schools, which is one of the more famous examples of this freedom naming, where a network of non-public fugitive learning type centers were set up to educate African American students because the education they received in segregated public school systems were so deplorable. It also was about creating citizens and about creating folks who could carry out protests. So again, I'm trying to draw attention to the idea that the renaming of these practices and people and places was not a superficial marketing. It was a much more fundamental fugitive praxis, in the word of one of my colleagues, a way of theorizing and imagining and rehearsing freedom. It was a way of altering the atmosphere of living in white supremacy and in Jim Crow oppression. And so the idea of having a place named Freedom, wasn't just something that seemed to match, the marketing of the movement, but actually signaled a fundamental anti-racist remaking of place, which I think is powerful and brilliant on their part, and especially interesting for us who are scholars of naming. The one thing that I bring up to you is one of the most fascinating examples of this freedom naming is freedom houses. And I know there's a lot of text here, and I apologize, but I want to make sure that I get this as clearly as possible to you. And what this really reflects is that SNCC often applied the name freedom to a series of homes or houses that it was involved in. And these homes or houses were structures that were rented to serve as headquarters for civil rights workers, or they could have been, and often were, the houses of Black families within local communities who hosted and fed and protected civil rights workers. So it was sometimes houses that SNCC rented. Sometimes it was houses that already existed that Black families living in the communities for generations would welcome the civil rights workers in. And it was an economic necessity because you could not find a hotel room that would be rented to these activists. They had very little money. They didn't have the kind of resources to buy homes or to rent large hotel rooms anyway, if they could get them. And so it was a necessity, but also it fit in so nicely with their grassroots organizing campaign, because they were not above the people that they were helping organize. They were in there with those people, helping them organize. They were wanting to understand and learn about and be of assistance to the communities in the Deep South where they were organizing the right to vote, trying to end segregation, trying to empower communities economically. So the freedom name on these houses was related to a kind of place that was being created, a contact zone that was being created in the civil rights movement. And what was interesting is that if you truly look at the Freedom House as a freedom namescape, what you really do, and you go inside these homes, you understand that there was a very special kind of social relations being carried out in these freedom houses. They practice integration. You had Blacks and whites living together in these freedom houses in counties where that kind of integration would get people arrested and killed. You had the case where the houses were often the sites of tremendous tension, where they were frequently shot up and shot at by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists. So they were sites of Black self-defense, as the homeowners, these local Black families, often sat on the porch and defended the civil rights workers sleeping inside. The SNCC itself had considered the idea of Black self-defense as a way of dealing with the violence inflicted on these freedom houses. And so it's important to remember that, by 1964, during Freedom Summer, there were 35 of these freedom houses that were burned or bombed. So, even though they were meant to protect civil rights workers and families that were protecting them, they still were very vulnerable to attack. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, and I'm probably stretching this out too far, is I'm trying to get you thinking about how the freedom naming, that place naming, that taking control of the names of these communities and their homes and these houses was part of a civil rights activist strategy, and also part of a remaking of what place meant in that part of the South. And in fact, right now, there are efforts in Mississippi to preserve and interpret freedom houses and to actually remember that Black placemaking that went on behind the naming. I'm going to skip that and basically go to my conclusion, my take-home points, that place names have long been an underappreciated role in history and the spatiality of the Black freedom struggle in the United States. It really speaks in many ways to this complex narrative, material, affective, and reparative capacities of place names. This Black onomastic activism I talk about is really part of it's not just recent, it's not just new, it's part of a tradition of survival and creativity and resistant world making. And I like the idea of thinking about naming in the context of Black livingness, which I think is a powerful way of thinking about those bigger social relations and humanity. And so in many ways, Black naming was about asserting control over the stories, the spaces, and the identities that define the lives of those Black communities. And then finally, SNCC's tactical naming. I mean, it used naming in a very tactical way. And there's many more examples, by the way. I'm going to flash up a QR code where you can certainly access the full paper if you like. But SNCC's tactical naming was really about building an infrastructure. It wasn't just about building symbols. It was about building an infrastructure for liberation, for making freedom a place, and putting names to work beyond simply, again, issues of symbolism. But really the power of the place name within SNCC and the power of place naming for all of us right now is about assembling and connecting names to a reconstruction of society. If we're going to realize the real social justice potential and capacity of renaming, the name in and of itself cannot do the job. We have to put it to work with all these other things that are important to social geographic change. So there's the QR code. I'll give you a second there to grab that, and I'm done. So
Thank you, Professor Alderman. I would like, while I give time for my colleagues in the audience to think of questions, I'll make a brief comment, and I've got questions myself. The first thing, it seems to me that both your presentations point to the avoidance of names. In the case of Vuosaari, the avoidance is this toponymic detachment has to do with a rejection of racism in the case of Mogadishu Avenue, and in the case of Aurinkolahti, this escape from gentrification. And in the case of American naming, Black naming process, it has to do with making room for another history to be told. My question for Professor Ainiala is, what method, researching detachment is very difficult because we need a kind of negative evidence. People avoid the name, so we have to kind of force them, I'm sorry to use the word, but kind of force them to tell which words they avoid. My question is, what methodological avenues we could follow, other methodological approaches we could have to research toponymic detachment?
Yes, thank you for this question. I would say that there is kind of no exact way or kind of good way just to go and ask people which names do you avoid, but it's rather than doing kind of proper field work, making observations, trying to kind of find the various ways people talk about places and their names. So multitude of materials and methods instead of just simply asking people But when people tell about their own, for example, their own home surroundings or the like, they kind of often are tended to express their various attitudes towards places and their names.
Thank you. Professor Alderman, my question would be, how do you think we can embed onomastics into education so that we can build a healthier and fairer namescapes?
Well, thank you for that question. It's an excellent one. It's something actually I'm so happy you asked, because it's something I've been wrestling with myself, because just earlier in October, I finished a workshop with some public school teachers here in Tennessee, and we focused for 2 days on how to incorporate that very issue of critical name studies into their classrooms. And it was about bringing historical examples into the classroom. It was about introducing teachers to some of these theories. It was about really, in many ways, helping the teachers help their students do what, and again, I'm a geographer, I'm a geek. How do you do critical landscape analysis? How do you pay attention to your surroundings? How do you listen to communities? How do you hear what people are saying about names, and what role names have played historically within a particular community? And at least here in the United States, we have a big job to do in terms of bringing in that onomastic activism, onomastic, analysis, because we haven't done a very good job of encouraging our young people, or even our older people like me, to do that kind of critical landscape reading and critical landscape analysis. But I think what it requires, I'll shut up here in a second. What it requires is that we need name scholars taking their work from journals, books, conferences, policy, and bringing it to the level of communities, whether it's in schools, K through 12 schools here in the United States, or whether it's teach-ins, or whether it's a community panel. We need to start expanding our educational influence. And I think that's where name scholars can play a huge role.
I was wondering if anybody in the audience has questions. Yes. Fab, please, the microphone. Yeah, they're getting the microphone.
Good morning. My question is for Professor Alderman, and it's just a curiosity. I'm interested in institutional place names change, and I wonder if the name of Gulf of America is actually replacing the name Gulf of Mexico. At what levels is this institutional change been successful?
Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate that very much. I can tell you that as far as, like, for example, some of the professional organizations that deal with mapping, some of the commercial corporations that deal with mapping, as far as, for example, public schools, they have in fact made that change. Now, sometimes they've made the change and then they're actually implementing a dual naming, where they're having Gulf of America, which is something I don't use, and then of course Gulf of Mexico. But yeah, that, institutionally speaking, I would not suggest that it's happen everywhere the same way, but it certainly has been implemented institutionally in certain key spots.
Thank you.
Which I'm sorry, I'll stop. Go ahead.
Professor Alderman, please complete your answer.
No, I just think it was a fantastic question. And the reason that I'm really interested in the question is that the idea of thinking about how institutionally accepted or approved this is becoming is really important to the idea that once you do a name change like that, it has a life and an afterlife. That once a name change is made, it's not easy to just simply change it back in 4 years or whatever the case may be. And that's why these kinds of name changes are have such important social, political, educational implications. Is that, you know, we don't change names like we change shirts. And so it's, you know, that name change will of Gulf of Mexico to America will have ramifications, reverberations for some time.
Okay, any other questions?
Bom dia, vou falar em português e vou pedir para o Vitor traduzir ou fazer um resumo da minha pergunta. Foi um prazer ouvir ambas as palestras. Eu quero fazer uma mesma pergunta para os dois palestrantes. Esses casos de não aceitação de nomes próprios de lugar me fez lembrar sobre as questões de política linguística, algo que eu gostaria de chamar de política linguística onomástica. Me parece que a palestra da Ainiala envolveu mais uma política de baixo para cima. É uma maneira popular de não aceitar um nome de lugar, é simplesmente não usá-lo. Ou usar qualquer outro, não usar o nome rejeitado. Já na palestra do professor Alderman, nós temos uma briga pela mudança oficial de nomes. Então, seria uma outra maneira de reagir a um nome não aceito. Eu gostaria que ambos falassem um pouco sobre esses dois tipos de política linguística onomástica, de cima para baixo e de baixo para cima.
Okay, so Professor say this question has this content. She said it was a pleasure to listen to you, and she's got the same question for both of you. She says that the cases of non-acceptance of names reminds her of onomastic language policies. Okay, in the case of Professor Ainiala's, it seems to be a bottom-up approach that people do avoid using unofficially, informally. They decide not to use the official name. And in the case of Professor Alderman, people fight and struggle for official change. So she'd like you to comment on these two kinds of policies, a bottom-up approach and a kind of struggle, top-down version of it in terms of onomastic language policy.
That's a fantastic answer, and I probably should not have let you go first because I think you got my answer. But I would only add that, you know, in terms of thinking about this interaction between top-down, bottom-up, I think this idea of actually engaging in dialogue with communities in terms of how they see and speak and feel about these names is hugely critical. And I would suggest, you know, I served on a federal advisory committee for 2 years during the Biden administration with Secretary of Interior, in which we actually developed a set of principles for reconciliation in place naming that was an attempt to suggest that place name policy should have certain key features. And one of those was this participatory procedural justice that needs to happen. It also had to pay attention to histories of inequality. It had to pay attention to this tendency to reduce names to transactions and commodities. Now, unfortunately, that those principles will probably never see the light of day for quite a while. But I think that was a good start. It was a good start that we need to have policies that actually are about bringing the grassroots and the top down together. And a lot of those policies were informed by committee members I served with from indigenous communities, tribal nations. And they were hugely helpful in teaching me about what names mean for them and how their grassroots concerns need to be part of the national policy picture.
Okay.
Do you have time? Yeah.
I think we've got a couple of minutes.
Just a question. Thank you very much, Professor Ainiala, Professor Alderman, for the interesting presentation, interesting talks. There are many people, my question is for Professor Alderman, Derek Alderman. There are many people who think that this subject is not important, this is irrelevant. Of course, we think that is, no? We are discussing this subject here. My question is, what can we do to involve society, to involve people, to consider this topic as a relevant topic to the society?
Yeah. So really appreciate that question. That is probably my chief challenge as a place name scholar. Is that in fact a lot of times place names are disregarded as performative. They're disregarded as just symbolic. They're not considered part of sort of the material social reality with these big consequences and implications. And in fact, you hear that not just from those who are opposed to change, but you also hear that from those progressive communities that think, oh, we should be spending our time on bigger things or other issues. And I don't think it's an issue that I think the way I try to represent it when I speak to people and interact is that it's not about saying place naming is the only issue. It's not about place naming being an issue by itself, but it sort of goes back to my point during my talk is that we've got to start assembling naming and naming rights and naming injustices within a larger assemblage of social, cultural, political, geographic concerns that directly impact opportunity, disparity, freedom. And so it's about getting names. Yeah, you do have to prove that names are important, but you prove that names are important by getting it involved in a bigger discussion. And that's one of the reasons I think the civil rights movement was so interesting to me, is that I noticed that with looking at SNCC is that they were not necessarily, trying to prove anything about place naming or names in general, but it was intimately part of their tactics. It was intimately part of their political imagination. And that could be a guide to us for framing how we talk about it. So I probably haven't given you a great answer, but it's a really fine question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think if nobody's got any questions, does anybody else have questions? No? Well, that brings us to a close of our plenary of the session. I'd like to thank Professor Alderman and Professor Ainiala very much for their contribution. There is lots of there's a lot to think about from now on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And please keep on following us on YouTube and attending the sessions that we have later on in the afternoon. Thank you.